Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tyree Boyd-Pates, and I am the Associate Curator of Western History at the Autry Museum of the American West. I'm honored and privileged, along with the Autry trustees and staff, to welcome you to the Autry's artist salons, Compton Cowboys, Blackness in Los Angeles. Joining me today is a good friend, Walter Thompson-Hernandez. Walter is a former New York Times reporter and has also written for NPR, Fusion, BBC, and The Guardian. Um, he is the 2019 recipient of the Whiting Creative Nonfiction Award for his book, The Compton Cowboys, The New Generation of Cowboys in America's Urban Heartland. To begin, if you have any questions during our conversation, please enter them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. And the Autry of the American West represents something slightly different to each of you who visit us physically and virtually. For me, this personal connection is one of the most gratifying and defining strengths of our institution, along with continuing our Collecting Community History initiative. I'm excited for today's program highlighting the African American experience in the West. Walter's work and this history of Blackness in Los Angeles, past and present, and the complexity of identity for youth in Los Angeles's urban centers. We take pains to offer treasures for all visitors as we present, represent, and purposely complicate traditional and modern visions of the American West. Walter, thank you for joining us today.
Tyree, what's going on?
My man. I am so happy that you're with us, man, because this conversation is not only necessary, but you have actually contributed in really gainful ways in moving the needle forward and the conversation forward. And I really just kind of want to unpack who you are, the process behind the book, some of the history surrounding this moment, and then lastly, the future of your work and the Compton Cowboys at large. So yeah, man, let's get started. Tell everyone, because I know we're tell everyone about your background growing up in Los Angeles, and notably as it relates to your career in journalism and desiring to document the Black experience in the American West, especially for the Compton Cowboys.
Absolutely. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm really excited. I'm a huge fan of the museum. It's like a really cool opportunity. I'm from LA, right? I'm born and raised in Southeast LA, about 5 minutes away from Watts. And I am someone who, kind of grew up in schools, right? LAUSD schools, never really learning about, the Black cowboy experience per se, right? And, it's really interesting because the Compton Cowboys, right? Are a group of friends, who are essentially the second and third generation, African-American writers in Compton, right? But it wasn't until I was about 6 years old that I kind of first saw Black cowboys in Compton. And it was just this really sort of watershed moment, because it's a moment where I'm sort of confronted with this this really rich history, while also understanding that that history wasn't being taught to me in schools, right? And I think the most important part of that about that experience was that I wasn't alone, right? There were other sort of Black and brown kids like me, all over LA and South LA, who were also being neglected of this story. And so I think as an adult and as a New York Times writer, it was really important for me to come back home essentially, and to really sort of think about the Cowboys and to think about what they represent and how important their story is.
Which is something that resonated with me. I lived in Compton for about 2 years, and a lot of people don't know that Compton has such a complex rural history and agricultural community. And when I was reading and scanning through the book in preparation for this conversation, I was like, you really jumped into the heart of the conversation, but also the heart of Compton. And you did that really wisely with the Compton Junior Posse, aka the Compton Cowboys, and which I learned from your book is a community of 10 people, and you came, which came about with a desire to create community in South LA. Why did the Compton Cowboys feel it was necessary to come together, especially as Black youth, predominantly Black youth, in this day and age?
Absolutely. So the Compton Cowboys are essentially the 2.0 version of a group called the Compton Junior Posse, right? Which was started in 1988 by Maisha Akbar. The Compton Cowboys are essentially the children, who she helped raise and who she taught how to ride horses to, right? It was really important for them because like a lot of them kind of like stopped riding horses, right? Throughout like their teenage years, like things came up, they started families, and a lot of different things happened. They sort of come together in 2017, like in this sort of like serendipitous way, right? Where I think they're all kind of in their mid to late 20s, early 30s, and there's this sort of like longing and yearning for the experiences that they shared in this really special horse ranch in the middle of Compton, right? And I think for a lot of people, sort of like juxtaposing like Compton and cowboys and like Compton and horse ranch, like seems kind of paradoxical, right? For a lot of folks who aren't from Compton, who aren't from the area, but
Right.
like the what they experienced, as young Black men and women, right, was that this horse ranch located in an area of Compton called the Richland Farms, was essentially like so much more than a place that housed horses, right? Like it was a place that essentially became like a healing center. There's this sort of like really powerful and incredible redemptive quality about animals and horses, right? That I feel like the Compton Cowboys were exposed to really early. And so as adults, I think like there was always this like yearning to like come back to that, this sort of like pull of the ranch. And so they officially came together in 2017 as the Compton Cowboys, as a sort of like an official moniker. And they're committed to doing a few things, but I think more importantly, they're committed to obviously reinserting the Black cowboy and cowgirl back into the history books, right?
Mhm.
Like I said earlier, this was a story, in Compton school districts. Like it's not even, which is so interesting how, these schools exist both in and around Compton, and they're not teaching about the experiences of like Black cowboys and cowgirls, like both as like really important figures in the founding of the American West per se, but also in Compton, right? And so I think they were really aware of that and wanted to sort of like, do something about that, but also, preserve this like legacy, right? I think the Compton Cowboys are like so keenly aware that if they don't pass on this tradition of equestrian culture and of horse riding culture, then they might be Compton's last Black Cowboys. And I think that's like a real fear for them.
Mm-hmm. And which is it's an interesting paradox because growing up in Los Angeles, like you and I have, we we know how the strengths and areas of development for the Los Angeles Unified School District, especially
Right.
about like histories that reflect their student bodies. Which is
Hmm.
interesting because as you're reclaiming and relinquishing certain narratives about our community, why do you think it's important, or what does the Compton Cowboys say about being Black in Los Angeles's urban centers and how it has impacts on others? Because there are other cowboys in other urban centers. A lot of people don't know.
100%. I mean, it says so much about the Black experience, right? It says that like there's this obvious like cultural and racial erasure of the achievements and experiences of Black folks, not just in LA, but throughout the country, right? And I think the fact that this sort of like story has been essentially, relegated to like the corners of like historical archives, right? Like to me, this symbolizes that this form of erasure continues to happen. And so I think, the fact that these men and women, hop on their horses and ride horses, like there's something really political about that and essentially historical about that, right? So is this sort of like this like relationship where like the Cowboys are essentially riding to not be forgotten.
And,
Yeah.
it's funny because when you wrote your 2018 article
Hmm.
about the Compton Cowboys, I remember it coming across my timeline in my feed,
Hmm.
and I lived in Compton for 2 years,
Right.
and occasionally I saw someone on horses, but I didn't know, like many audiences who were
Hmm.
reading, who read the time in the article, um, they didn't understand the beautiful relationship between
Hmm.
Blackness and the equestrian
Hmm.
lifestyle that you were presenting and unfolding in front of us,
Hmm.
and especially in one of the most an area that is perceived as one of the most dangerous cities or areas of the city. But talk to me about that profile and what it was like writing it, its
Hmm.
response, Clearly, we're here today because of
Totally.
and where and how it led us to where we are to have this conversation.
Absolutely. So that 2018 New York Times feature, I think, like really sort of like set the tone for all of this, right? Like that was a story. I had just traveled to Ghana to work on a story, and to be honest, I was really homesick. Like, I wanted to be back in LA. At that point, I was like a global subculture writer, so I was traveling everywhere. And to be honest, I was just homesick. Like, I wanted to be with like my mom and my aunt. I miss them. And so I was like, all right, like, how do I find a way to like be able to be in LA for a while? So something told me to really think about like Compton's Cowboys, and I was like, I wonder if they're still doing their thing. Like, I wonder if they're still around. And I say that because like I really thought about the sort of like visceral response that I had to seeing them for the first time, and like I sort of had to channel that like my 6-year-old self essentially, and I was like, I feel like that'd be a really beautiful story for like folks to not just know but to understand. And so I did what like any other millennial reporter would do, and I found them on Instagram, right. I found on Instagram, and like I sent them a DM, and I was like, hey, I'm a New York Times writer. My name is Walter. Like, I live 10 minutes away from your ranch. Is it possible to interview for a story? And like it was interesting because I think like when I showed up to the ranch, like there was like skepticism, right? Because like in so many different ways, like I don't fit this like quintessential New York Times like reporter vibe, right? Like
Fascinating.
Yeah, like I don't look like some older white guy who like lives in Connecticut or something like that. Like I'm me. So when I pull up to the ranch and knock on their door, like there's like like deep questions, right? Like, who is this guy? What do you want? And it's funny because like I experience that a lot, so I have to like carry like business cards with me wherever I go. Like New York Times, business cards. So yeah, it was so that happened. But you know what? Shortly after that, I think there was this like really sort of like this like honest relationship that was formed because like they realized that like I live right down the street. I'm from the community. We're all the same age. We all kind of grew up in the same way. And I think for them and for me, it was really special to essentially like be working on a story about a group of men and women who reminded me of like the friends who I grew up with, right? So I think like that was the biggest difference, is that like this wasn't a story that was like voyeuristic or like sensational. It was kind of told with their help, and I think it was a really powerful story because of that.
It is almost it's funny that you say this because it sounds like it wasn't a story. It wasn't a story about them. It wasn't a story for them. It was a story about them. And and I think ironically, museums as a whole, even in what some of the things that I'm bringing and teasing out at the Autry is like curating with communities, not for communities. And so naturally, as you were writing for community as opposed to about it, what was the response after the story came out? Because not only did it resonate with them, seemingly naturally on the surface, but what was what response did you get, and how did it lead to the book today?
Yeah, totally. It was a really overwhelmingly positive response. I think for me, it's like, so many of us like fall guilty of this, right? Like if we're from an area and from a certain community, we kind of assume that like everyone knows about this story, right? But it was just so intriguing and fascinating for me to like, most of the responses I was getting in emails and messages were from people I never met before, people in Finland, people in Iowa, people in Florida, people in France, like people who were really sort of like, I think, like just captivated by the story for obvious reasons. I think, unfortunately, Compton has a stigma around the world. When folks think of Compton, they think of like gangs and violence and Dr. Dre and Eazy-E and whatever. And like, that's part of the story. Like, there's no denying that. Like those experiences are a part of Compton, but they're not all of Compton. And I think for a lot of folks, it led to this like, it became like a viral story. And it led to, a book deal. It led to a film deal. It led to all the different things. And I think like for me, I think you're absolutely right. Like it was really important to like, create a story with them. I think like both in the arts and in the creative world and journalism and in museum culture, right? I think so many of us like were essentially trained in, to think that we are the experts, right? And I think part of that is true. I think, there is a sort of like rigorous training that we go through, to do what we do. There's hours of work and practice and training, but I think ultimately there's like a reframing that I think has happened, and that I fully believe in. I'm not the expert of someone's story, right? Like I can never be the expert. If anything, the first thing I tell people when I meet them for a story is that, listen, like you're the expert here, not me. And I think for a lot of folks, like that sounds refreshing, right? Because like there's obviously a history, in anthropology, right, where it's like you have these trained anthropologists going into communities of color around the world and sort of extracting information
Right.
and parachuting in. And I think for me, like that's never been my approach. And I also see that in you as well. I know like both of us sort of share that, there's this sort of like, there's this egalitarian sort of idea of how we ask questions and how we work with and for communities.
Right. It's a very egalitarian, democratic process, which effectively broadens the landscape for more communities to get involved with. And,
Totally.
yeah, it was really refreshing to hear you say it, because it reminds me of how whether it is a museum exhibition or a book or film, it's the medium is the message, and so we are carriers thereof. And it sounds, when you talk about it, and what I read from reading your book, is like there's an enthusiasm that you have, Walter, and like it sounds like you and the Compton Cowboys are essentially like a pot of gold, or like you've landed on a pot of gold, because it sounds like such a rewarding experience for you and them. And can you provide like what's your favorite or most rewarding aspect for you and for them so far? Because outside of like the notoriety and visibility that kind of comes with great stories like this.
I think, if I'm being completely honest with you, I think, the most rewarding aspect of this experience, but also all experiences for me when like, writing or like documenting or storytelling, right, is to know that, I got the story right. Like that to me means more than the amount of reshares, the amount of retweets, the amount of awards, whatever. It's like texting that person or community the story that I worked on them about, and kind of like anxiously waiting for their response, right? You're like, oh man, how do they feel? How they're gonna feel? And I think, but it's tricky, right? Because I think as storytellers, the only thing we can guarantee is that it's gonna be an honest depiction of their lives. Like that's it. Like the goal is never to sort of like lionize someone, or like, nobody's a hero or a villain most times, right? And so for me, with this process, like it's knowing that, especially in the book, because like the book covers so much more than that 2,000 word feature story, right? Like the book, excavates, violence and death and joy and love, and it's kind of heavy in some moments, right? So I think for me, the most joy I get is learning that like it was honest and it's true to their experience, and like there's nothing more powerful than saying like, hey Walter, you got the story right, like that. Like I'm getting chills right now because like no, I'm serious, because like it's that powerful to me, like that means so much more than like an editor coming back to me and writing me, hey, a great story, no, I don't really care about that, I really don't.
I agree with you, because being a museum curator and having the privilege to be at the Autry now, and formerly at the California American, I remember moments when curating exhibitions about Black gospel music in Los Angeles.
I remember that show.
An elder woman visited the exhibition, and she saw herself in one of the this is the background. She saw herself in the photo and said, "You got my church right." Like, it's those moments, and so it's also centering her for the first time in her whole life, and
right.
The beauty it is to have her get her flowers now. I think is what you're saying, and what I understand in my experiences to also share. That's powerful, man. And as we reclaim these stories and we relinquish old ones, right? A lot of people don't know the history about the Black equestrian lifestyle. For instance, I think it was the Smithsonian that says that
Mm-hmm.
what is it? That 1 in 4 of all
Mm-hmm.
cowboys were black through the 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
And my curiosity is that, like you, like me, like the historians and the journalists before us, why do you think it's so essential and so vital for us to excavate the history that coincides with the legacies that the Compton Cowboys are building off from the posse before them?
Totally, yeah. That's a great question. I think it's important because, I think we all deserve full and complete histories.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think like at the core of all of this is that, I think what we all deserve to know exactly what happened. Right. And I think like that might sound reductive or like simplified, but it's true.
No,
Like,
I don't know. Yeah, I agree.
right. It's like I think like we are all deserving to know what exactly happened, how it happened, and why it happened.
Yeah.
And I think like neglecting the experience of the Black Cowboys to me, falls within this like, historical lineage of like erasure. And I think, 1 in 4 of every Cowboys in the West was in fact Black. And like they had such a prominent role in like, and what exactly happened in the West. Right. And so for me, like,
Mm.
I'm a history buff, like I'm a history nerd, right? And I think, it was just really important for me. And again, like I'm not the first person to document the experience of Black Cowboys. Like I'm not, I think there's been a few folks, and after me, I hope there'll be more. But I think in terms of the Compton Cowboys, it was like kind of like, in a sense, my story to tell because of my relationship to them, because of the proximity of my life to Compton. So I think the Compton Cowboy story was like kind of like I was chosen to tell that story,
Right.
right? And I think it was really important. I think like, you know, all the stars kind of aligned, and it's been really incredible to like place the Compton Cowboys in this like really rich and beautiful historical context, while also understanding that like this story and that in this book, it's like so much more than a book about cowboys actually, right? It's actually deeper than that. It's actually about blackness, about like what it means to be Black in LA, what it means to be Black right now. And I think that's what I hope people take away from this book.
Yeah. When um, I having had a relationship and conversation with Randy,
Mm-hmm.
one of the Compton Cowboys, his story and his desire to make the Compton Cowboys known across the world reminds me of the rich legacy of like Bill Pickett and
Mm-hmm.
Nat Love and Black cowgirls like Henrietta William Foster. And
Right.
beautiful because Compton is such a complex place.
Mm-hmm.
And I was doing some research in preparation for this conversation, and and having lived there, I know that it says that before World War II, Compton was 95% white, and
Mm-hmm.
by 1970, Compton had become 65% African American, and today, even with Asia being mayor,
Yeah.
Compton is mostly Latinx today.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious to know, Mayor Asia Brown, by the way, uh, what role does Compton's racial landscape
Yeah.
play in the Black equestrian lifestyle, particularly for the Compton Cowboys?
Oh, yeah, that's really good. I think it's interesting. I think Compton sort of has had these like racial flows, right, of different sort of like demographic groups. It's interesting. A lot of folks don't know that like George Bush even lived in Compton. And
Yes. Our president, a sitting president, our president lived in Compton,
like,
California.
like George Bush and his family lived there for like 3 years. And I think like when I was in the research for this book, I was just like, what? Like, no way,
Yeah.
no way. But it's true. Like Compton, was predominantly white. And then the Great Migration happened, and like folks from the South really started to move to Compton. For reasons that were actually tied to agriculture and land and farm, right? Like folks
Mm-hmm.
from the South, folks from Texas, and Louisiana, and Oklahoma moved to Compton specifically so that they could sort of like transplant these like agricultural lifestyles and like horse lifestyles in Compton, right? And so when you think about Compton, it makes sense. It's so sprawled out. There's like land and there's space, so it makes sense, right? But I think today it's interesting. I think Compton is predominantly Latinx, and I think that's part of what makes this story so much more important, right?
Mhm.
And it's kind of like it's interesting, right? Because like on one hand, like it makes you really think about how Black folks have continued to be displaced, right? Like from cities and places. So it's kind of like there's melancholy there, right? And deep sadness about like, how it's like, oh, Black folks were essentially, moved from the South for like safety and protection and opportunity. And now we're kind of seeing that again, right? So it speaks to that, and it speaks to the sort of like ways that like Black folks have moved to live and survive and to experience joy and to live their lives. And it also speaks to migration and the way that like migration is also tied to like the human experience, right? So in terms of like racial experiences, it's interesting because we also have to be honest, right? Like Black and brown folks in Los Angeles, it's a it's a complicated story and relationship. Like I'm the son of a Black father, Mexican mother, myself, right? And for me, it's like that's always kind of been at the heart of what I do. It's to not sort of like sensationalize that experience, but like approach it with like honesty. And I think there have been racial tensions in Compton throughout time. You know, tensions that I experienced in writing this book and documenting this book. But at the same time, there's like something so special, I think, about what happens in the Richland Farms, right? Like in the Richland Farms, which is like where horse riders live in Compton, and it's still filled with like Black and brown families who subscribe to equestrian culture, who own horses. And so my experience was this, right? Is that what happens outside of the farms is not necessarily what happens in the farms.
Interesting.
Like no, really, like the power of these horses really brings Black and brown folks together in ways that like are astounding. And I'm not exaggerating. Like
I believe you.
I really mean that. It's like there's this like beautiful connection fostered through like a shared love of horses and a shared love of land. And that's something that to me was like really inspiring, and it also speaks to Randy, who you spoke about earlier. Who's now the leader of the Compton Cowboys. Like his whole mission is predicated on acknowledging that the horse ranch is special and beautiful, and to see that to find ways to replicate that model across the U.S. Right? Like he says all the time. He's like, we've tried everything else. We haven't tried horse ranches in the hood. Right? and I think Randy has a point. Randy's got a
How powerful. How powerful.
Like Randy's got a point. Like we're laughing because it's incredible actually, right?
It's true.
but it's true. Like he's not lying.
That's true. The last thing we've tried in our hoods, throughout the city is horses, and
we haven't done it.
We haven't done it, and I think there's still a value add to that. I think there's still a deep opportunity, and it reminds me too of just like the history of Los Angeles as a whole, because I know you're familiar with the Los Pobladores, like the original settlers of Los Angeles were Black and brown folks who were what they were on horses coming in to start and settle and establish Los Angeles. So I would be remiss not to bring that up, but I also as a historian see deep connections that I think can be teased out. Hopefully one day in an exhibition. Who knows?
Yeah, for sure. That'd be great. Really
cool. Who knows? But back to Compton, you as you're rewriting this narrative alongside the Compton Cowboys, there's also a narrative that has been globalized about Compton and at the hands of the most genius artists of our time. And of course, I argue, and so does the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, like NWA and Dr. Dre and Pulitzer Prize winning Kendrick Lamar, all out of Compton. How important is music to the Black equestrian lifestyle, i.e., the Compton Cowboys, in the city? And what was music inspiration for you writing the book?
Oh man, thanks for bringing up Kendrick. Like I just any opportunity to talk about Kendrick, I'm just really open.
Same.
Like talk could be about Kendrick actually.
No, seriously.
but no, I think like if we're talking about like Compton's like really rich musical sort of like soundscape, right? We have to talk about NWA and Brenton Woods, right? Or like all these other folks who come out of Compton. But Kendrick, to me, like his album, Good Kid, Mad City, was honestly the model for this book, right?
Wow.
Like, no, really,
Wow.
in writing this book and thinking about this book, like I listened to his album, right? Like my references weren't other text;
Hmm.
it was music essentially.
It was a response to his music.
Yes, and you know what? Like, I'd be lying to you if I would tell you that my goal was to make the book version of that album. And if you read the
Oh,
book,
what a powerful! That's powerful. That because
no,
that album is considered widely as a classic, like one of the most important albums in the last decade, right?
yeah,
So you're saying that this book is an answer, or your is an answer to that
what
classic album. It's powerful.
yeah, no, 100%. Because if you think about it, like that album, for like those who haven't listened to it, like there's like such a moving and profound narrative arc to that album. There's like character development, there's like tension, there's conflict, there's like, like there's so much going on in that album that like it doesn't read like an album. Like it reads like something.
No,
No, right. Like something that like James Baldwin or like Toni Morrison wrote, right?
absolutely.
Essentially, like
Undoubtedly.
it is so perfect and so valuable. So for me, I was like, okay, you know, how I feel listen to that album is how I want to feel when I write this book. And so it was such an important part of the experience. Like especially the song "Sing About Me," I'm Dying of Thirst. To me, it is like one of the most like moving
Mm.
musical experiences I've ever had in my life. And when I was thinking about the Compton Cowboys, like they're essentially good kids in a mad city. You know,
Bingo,
that's who they are.
bingo, bingo.
Like they are good kids in a mad city, and like spending more time with them, just help me understand that. Like we are all in some ways like products of our environment. You know, and some of them were involved with gangs. Prison time, all that. Complicated stuff. But I think like at the end of the day, they're all good kids in a mess city, and ultimately I was too, and I
And so
said,
was I.
oh,
So was I.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So it's like music was like such a big part of the experience, and especially Compton's music, and I'd argue that Kendrick Lamar is not just my favorite musician, but he's my favorite writer as well, and I'm hoping the book shows it.
And it's not surprising that your book is a response to that album, and that you can see the direct like literary parallels, because
Mm-hmm.
clearly the Pulitzer Prize winning
Right.
committee saw the same thing in his music,
Totally.
particularly for his latest his most recent efforts.
Mm-hmm.
This is profound because as we situate the racial landscape, the musical soundscape, it also reminds me of just like the political landscape that
Mm-hmm.
Compton has always had,
Right.
particularly in this moment. If I'm not mistaken, and having close proximity to your work as well as that city, the city of Compton and the Compton Cowboys actually were involved in a major peace rally that were on horseback throughout the city of Compton.
Mm-hmm.
Can you share about that day, the value it adds to the movement for Black lives,
Mm-hmm.
and the larger protests for in solidarity thereof, and just the joy that it brought the community? Because I thought your recent article in the Times documenting that was like too good to not share in this conversation.
Appreciate you. Thank you.
Yeah.
No, it was like such a profound experience for me. Like it had been a while since I had been back on the ranch, right? So when like Randy calls me and tells me that they're organizing, like a ride for peace, essentially, a ride for Black lives, I thought that was just so profound and moving, because like that hasn't happened before, right? In a sense, though, like it's interesting because, like throughout history, right? Like cavalries or like horses like usually lead the way, essentially, right? Throughout time. And so for me, like seeing the Compton Cowboys lead this march was just so profound and moving. And it was also really, really important because like usually, again, throughout time and history, mounted police, mounted police units have usually been on the other side of like peaceful demonstrators, right?
Absolutely.
And so there was something so, I think, moving about seeing Black men and women on horses, sort of on the opposite side of like mounted police, and it was essentially like a way. I think it was really political. It was a way to reclaim not just space, but to reclaim the idea of the impact of horses, right? Like horses have been used to like essentially enact power, to like articulate control over groups of people, predominantly Black and brown people usually. And here you have Black men and women from all over Southern California joining together, coming together, and like leading a peaceful march for Black lives. Like I had to be there, and I kind of had to write that story. And it was like such a profound experience, but also like, again, like letting us know that the Black cowboy and cowgirl experience is not just a story tied to history, right? It's also a very sort of like contemporary, modern day story. And, it's sort of brought everything for me full circle.
Can you share about the joy on the faces of the community when they saw the
cowboy? Yeah.
Because I agree with you wholeheartedly. And
mm-hmm.
It sounds almost very futuristic as well, like a reclamation, a reclaiming of history, but also advancing of future. So, but I would love to know about the joy, because you talk a lot about the joy that just them on horseback means to the community too.
Yeah. Like it means so much. I think like, people have this, there's a sort of like mythology around horses, right? And like a sort of like mysticism. It's like we know about horses, but we don't know everything about horses. And I think, when people see horses, there's almost this like this instant gratification, this like vulnerability that's expressed in like even like the most hardened adults.
Yeah, it's like, almost childlike. It's almost childlike.
Yeah, no, it's like when people see horses, especially at that peaceful march, it's like everyone was like remembered who they were as children, and people were reminded of like this like really I think like beautiful energy and spirit about them. And the energy was just really incredible that day, because like you had these animals who were leading the way in ways that reminded us of like this like purity that we experienced as children, right? Like long before we knew what systemic racism was, right? or all the different things. Like you have these like really beautiful and like profound and like perceptive and really intelligent animals who were there, and it was really incredible.
Right, and they were almost in solidarity with us as well.
100%. Yeah.
Which is such a powerful note, man. We have about 5 more minutes of questions before we take our friends' questions in the Q&A. So this is also an opportunity for anyone who's looking in to feel free to share your questions within the Zoom chat. But before we get out of the way, Walter, I'd love to ask you about the future, right? Like, well, what's next? What's next for you? What's next for the Compton Cowboys? How can we advance the topic of Black cowboy tradition today? Like, let's start off with that. Whichever one you want to start with. Let me know how.
Yeah, I'll do both. So I think the Compton Cowboys are still taking donations. Like there's, the pandemic kind of like halted their thriving youth program, which really sustains them. I think they're like slowly opening up the ranch again for like, like social distant rides, right?
that sounds like an article too.
100%. Yes. So they're doing that. They're also like, in sort of like brand campaigns and like modeling for all types of companies. That's really exciting. Like I said earlier, like when I signed this like book deal, we also signed a film deal.
Yeah. Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's huge.
It's so big. So Searchlight Pictures like bought the book, and like the production is about to start producing for the film. So it's really great because like the Cowboys are involved in that process, and it's been really cool because like both the Cowboys and I sort of were involved in both the book deal and film deal. Which to me is really great, right? Because like very rarely, I think, do like authors have the opportunity of not just working with like the people who they're documenting, but also like come into financial agreements, right? Which is like, and to be transparent, like most of the proceeds go back to the ranch, right?
Amazing.
So yeah. So that's happening. We're all really excited about that. For me personally, I have like an NPR podcast right now. It's called California Love. It came out.
Congratulations, by the way, it's fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. It came out weeks ago. I'm transitioning out of journalism more into the TV and film space, which I'm really excited about. So I'm excited about that.
I see a very bright future
For sure.
in this next phase of your career.
Yeah. So that's happening. I also like signed another book deal for like a memoir type book about my mom and I and about LA. So
fantastic.
What's happening?
Fantastic. You're going to be busy for a while.
Yeah, for sure.
You're going to be busy, and I'm really excited to hear about all of these tremendous opportunities, not only for you, but also the Compton Cowboys, and how it's going to be able to amplify their stories in a way in which I'm sure they could have only dreamed of. Mm-hmm. But it's also providing them equity into the conversation, so that they can be better for it later on after it's all said and done. And I think that's vital, especially when you're sharing stories, because so rarely do we have it in. Are we involved in those processes, especially as it becomes commercial? So kudos to you on that front, but also kudos to you on all of these endeavors. I think it's quite special. One more question for you before we get out of the way. We're both millennials, so I have to ask a social media question. Can you round out like what impact or what influence did social media have in helping you craft a story, helping them get their narrative out, and what's the value add of social media in really amplifying community histories in real time?
Yeah. No, I think it's really important, right? I think like what's different about amplifying these like stories and community histories now is that like now we have the access and the ability to like tell a story in a way that's almost like instantaneous. You know, like I could post something on Instagram, like a photo followed by a long descriptive caption in ways that like, you know, will reach, you know, a lot of different people and audiences around the world. And so the Compton Cowboys have been really sort of like keen and really great at like spreading their message through social media. And I think for our generation, you know, like we're really aware of the power of social media. You know, I think social media sometimes like can be negative and can be a lot. And, you know, there's a lot of things on social media that don't make sense or are strange or weird, but there's also something really beautiful about being able to connect and also to like, you know, think about how we can all sort of tell our stories now, right? And there aren't necessarily the gatekeepers that existed before, you know, and I think for my story, for what I do, it's really important to share that, and as well for the Compton Cowboys.
Man, Walter, thank you for this powerful conversation. And I know this is just one of many that will be
for sure. Totally.
On this book, but on future projects that you're going to be doing. So I can't wait. But I also want to, you know, also give room for everyone else to ask you some questions. So let us answer some of those questions from our guests. And again, if you have questions, please add them to the Q&A box, and we'll do so until the end of the hour. So far we have 3. So I'm gonna start off. I'm gonna answer live. So this one is question for. Hold on. This is a new function. Could you answer live? Could you say something about the men in the photos behind you, both of you? What year were those photos taken? Kay Tornberg. Oh, that's a great question, Kay. This didactic behind us is in the Autry on the lower level. And though many of those gentlemen's names are not known, but it is meant to, again, complicate the representations of who were cowboys and how the West was seen at that time. And so if you'd like, feel free. We'd love to provide more context about that and even book recommendations, because I'm currently working on some projects that deal with the Black cowboy tradition. And you can find my email or get contact with me on the Autry's website. So thank you, Kay. Let me get another one. So we got that one. Question for both of you. So Walter, what is the underlying message that you see this book giving younger and older generations? Please, I want to give you the floor.
I think this book, I hope, just like helps shed more light on the experiences of Black men and women, right? Like in a place like Compton, I think like most of the work that I do really like centers on this question about belonging, right? And I think for me, that's like such a common thread in all the projects that I do. And so for this book, like it's really a book about a group of childhood friends, right, who both feel like they belong to something and don't belong. And so I hope like the book can shed light on how sort of like, you know, in this case, in this model, right, a horse ranch can create this like really sort of intricate world and universe of belonging in a place like Compton.
Agreed. I think what this story, this book, this narrative does for younger generations is expand their horizons at further investigating their own identity. And whether that is on foot or on horseback, they can do that. And the barriers that are often afforded Black and brown youth in urban centers don't have to limit their expressions of themselves, or at least the investigation thereof. So that's what I think your work does really effectively in allowing them to see themselves on horseback too.
Yeah.
So we got some more questions. Was there challenges for you growing up as a mixed race young man and being accepted? Feel free to feel that if you'd like.
For sure, 100%. Like, I mean, like if you grow up in LA, right? Like the sort of Black and brown experience, like it's always going to be like interesting and complicated. And I think for me, like I didn't grow up with like my Black side of my family, so it was interesting to like sort of like craft this like identity of Blackness, guided through the experiences of my friends and their families, right? So it was challenging at times, and like growing up in LAUSD schools, like there's going to be like I experienced race riots, right, and racial conflicts, and like that was really hard at times. And I think as a young person, it's hard to like contextualize that. We don't know what's going on, but I think as an adult, you realize that there's like systems at play that have been trying to pit Black and brown folks against each other. So it's like easier to process, but still hard to understand it.
Well said. Well said. Thank you. Another question we have is, what is the origin of the word cowboy? I have an answer if you have an answer as well.
I'd love to hear your answer.
Oh, sure. So currently I'm investigating and doing a lot of research on the possibility of future exhibitions that deal with the Black cowboy tradition in the American West. And as I've been diving into, very cursory as of late because of extenuating circumstances, I've learned and am excited to share broadly that the word cowboy was attributed mostly to Black men and who were enslaved and forced to do all of the manual labor on the farm, in the ranch, and on the plantation, dealing directly with cows and horses and other cattle. And it's so interesting because we provide such a dignified view of the phrase cowboy, but if it was so dignified in history, the word boy, which has a negative connotation, would have never been attributed. So it only underscores that the original cowboys weren't in fact who we lionize today as these individuals, but in fact they were probably more brown than they were of the dominant group. And so hence the term cowboy and the proximity to labor for Black people in this country. So exciting to share those nuances and bring that to the core. So and it's no I would be remiss to not bring up how the Compton Cowboys are reclaiming that and just giving agency to the phrase and the term as a whole. We got one more question for us. Seeing cowboys show up this summer at the protests and the smiles and activities triggered me to think about the region and its roots. This conversation and agricultural heritage of Compton reminded me of the closing of South Central Farm 15 years ago. And then last year, the individual learned about the vertical farming project in Compton. What are your thoughts about the future opportunities for inner city residents to return to their community's agrarian roots, buttressed against tech industry investors and venture capital? It's a hell of a question. So feel free to tease it out as you will.
That's like such an important question. It's important because I think like there's something political about the way that like structural racism, right, has like really like tried to remove us from our agrarian roots, right? Like if you are a Black or brown person, like you come from the land, right? so like there's something political and structural about a system that is trying to remove us from what we have known for generations and thousands of years, right? So it's my hope, that a book like this can sort of like underscore the importance of like animals and land and agriculture in the experience of like Black and brown folks, not just in Los Angeles, but everywhere, right? So if this book can like sort of push that conversation forward about like how we can sort of like re-access land and space and vegetables and healthy foods for our communities, I think like it's a success, right? But yeah, that's such an important question, especially right now. Like Los Angeles has continued to be gentrified. Like all these like tech developments are really in some ways kind of like furthering us from spaces and lands that we need to
Occupy. Right. Very true. Very well said as well. And I think there are grassroots movements that are building in order to circumvent those things from happening from very powerful individuals. So, and I think your work supports and broadens their desires and largely their demands to make sure that equity is had from them with those companies. I have two more questions. How do you see the museum experience making an impact on diversity in the West and exploring stories of all culture? How do you see the museum experience making an impact on diversity in the West and exploring stories of culture? Please feel free to take that. I have an answer as well.
Yeah. And I think like the work that you're doing to me is so important, right? Like I feel um, like diversifying these museum experiences is like part of the process that needs to happen. Like, right, like you need people who are from these communities. You need folks who have a stake in these communities, because like it's not enough to like just like say we want to do things, but like the work has to be done. And I feel like that's why I admire your work so much. It's like you like really stand by what you believe in, and there's like a lot of stakes.
Yes, oh, thank you, dear brother. I appreciate that, and I feel the same way about you. I think in this moment, and why it was so advantageous to join the Curator ranks at the Autry was because I think the Autry is, again, like they're complicating and wanting to wrinkle the perceptions of what the American West is. And given my contributions to the canon, formerly at CAM, it was a natural or organic next step to assist in that, in bringing and broadening out the perceptions of what the American West is, particularly the Black experience, because there's so much that the Academy knows, but there's so little that the general public knows. And I want to be an interlocutor. This is very similar to what you do so masterfully with articles and your media. It's just like using the gallery walls to disrupt some of those interpretations about us this entire time. So it's very much an opportunity to do the same work alongside you. We have one more, and I think then after this we'll close. Can you speak to other films or projects that demonstrate or misinterpret the actual Black cowboy experience? I have an answer. You can have an answer. Feel free.
I'd love to hear your answer.
Oh, sure. A colleague of mine by the name of Joshua Garrett, he is doing some really great work and has been doing some really great work at the Autry, and he has this series called This is a Western. And what he does is he takes films and he puts them under a microscope, and he investigates and interrogates what makes them a Western, or at least falls under this. And he has a future exhibition under the same thing. And having conversations with him has broadened my perceptions of how like Star Wars is actually a Western film. And George Lucas would say the same thing. But also how Boys in the Hood is a Western. Naturally that's set in the West, but also deals a lot with the same tropes that we've seen Gene Autry or other figures like other Western films deal with. And so I'm doing some digging, because even Django is a Western. And all of these films, through Josh's work, is helping me to reclaim some of those narratives and also provide a fresher lens. So that's just it in a nutshell. And so I naturally want to give you the last word. Do you have any parting words for us for our time together today?
Yeah, not a lot, just like thank you for this opportunity. I feel like this has been like such a really incredible conversation. Thank you to the Autry for having this talk. I feel like it's one that I would have preferred to have in person, so
Naturally.
but like, we're all doing our best, so
yes. No. I like the Autry say that we are so excited about the work that you're doing. We're so excited that we were able to partner today and continue to amplify this great work and that you've been doing at the intersection of community and journalism and media. And we cannot wait to collaborate on other projects together. And just thank you for joining us today for the Autry Artist Salon. And again, thank you all who are on this Zoom call. We wish we could have been with you all physically in the galleries, but we still thank you for taking time to hear more on the Compton Cowboys. And so that's all from us today. Tyree Boyd-Pates signing off, Associate Curator of the Autry. And until next time, you all have a great day. Thank you, Walter.